You know, in the number of years I've been doing this podcast, I've had some folks ask me, hey, what about all those pictures on your wall, all those things that we see behind you? Well, I film in my office, and yes, there's pictures on my wall of things that I have done over my lifetime. The one picture people keep talking about is the one over my shoulder, that one back there, standing in front of a T-38. And I said, yep, that's when I was going through undergraduate pilot training for the United States Air Force. They said, well, how'd you get into that? How'd that happen? Well, you got a moment? I guess I'll tell you. I attended college from 1965 to 1969. And anybody who knows anything about what was going on in the world back in those days, know we were involved with the Vietnam War. And so obviously, I was going to college during that time period. And when I got out of college in 1969, when I graduated, obviously that would have put me in available for the draft because the draft was a big thing back in that era. If you remember all the draft demonstrations and people burning their draft cards and all sorts of stuff like that, that would have put me in line for the draft. Now, in 1969, the United States government decided they were going to have their first lottery, a national lottery where everybody's birthday was put into a drum, and they would draw out names out of the drum, the birth date, and that would establish what the pecking order in the draft was. So the first number pulled out of the bin, that would be draft number one, and the second number would be draft number two, and so on and so forth until you got to 365 total numbers in a year. All right, so that was December 1st, 1969. And I remember that day because I was driving back from work that the day that was going on, listening on the radio because it was broadcast everywhere, and listening for the numbers drawn. And I think the first number drawn was September 17th or 14th, somewhere in that era there. And I kept listening for the numbers because they said, well, only about the first 15 or 20 numbers back in 1969, 1970 would actually be subject to the draft. So anybody over, say, number 25 probably wasn't going to be drafted. Okay, that's what they said. And it was a big show they put on. They had this big drum and their capsules that each had a birth date in there. And so everyone in that era, my era, were listening for their birthday. When was it going to show up? And I kept listening through that show, and it kept going on and on and on. And I still didn't hear my birthday number called. Well, finally, I was driving home from work, and I remember the road I was on. I remember the crossing intersection and the stoplight I was sitting at, which is really weird, when they finally called out my number. And they called out number 361 out of a total of 365. So my draft number was 361. Now, if I had been born one day earlier, my draft number would have been 31. If I'd have been born one day later, my draft number would have been like 257, somewhere in there. So, was I lucky? Yes, I was. But that didn't stop me because I had a dream, like many people do. I'm a military brat. I've grown up in military bases. I was driving out a military base when they were calling out numbers, for crying out loud. I wanted to go and serve in the military, and ultimately was given the opportunity to join the United States Air Force. Now, if you want to become a pilot in the Air Force, which is what my goal was, that was my dream, always to become a pilot in the United States Air Force. Well, there's a couple of ways, there's about 3 different ways you could get into the Air Force and into pilot training. Number one was through the academy. The Air Force Academy, we call it the zoo, or the Blue Zoo, whatever you choose to. We call them Zoomies, anybody from the academy. That's way number one. Way number two was people in ROTC. Now, the college that I was going to had Army ROTC, which I wanted nothing to do with. They did not have Air Force ROTC. So I couldn't go through an Air Force ROTC to be commissioned as second lieutenant. And you figure the Air Force Academy makes up about 45% of the people going into pilot training, and the ROTC makes up about the other 45%. So only about 10% at that time. Only 10% of people who are college graduates who went through officers training school actually made it to pilot training. And I was one of those people that, got qualified for officers training school. Now you take this back in those days. Now I'm talking 1970. It was a 12-week course. It happened in San Antonio, Texas. Originally, it was on San Antonio. It was on Lackland Air Force Base. Well, then they created an annex of Lackland called Medina. And so they decided to transfer the school over there, the Air Force Officers Training School over there, because that was where the women were and many of the men were, but they still had some remnants of people living on the Lackland and old World War II unair-conditioned military barracks. That's what it was. And I happened to be the last class of people that was on Lackland in those unair-conditioned military barracks in August in San Antonio. If you know anything about Texas in August in San Antonio, it's hot. It's humid. So we stayed there for the first 6 weeks of a 12-week training period. Our first 6 weeks were at Lackland. In the heat and the humidity, we survived. The last 6 weeks, when we were upper class, as they called it, we moved to Medina for the final 6 weeks. And after 12 weeks of being in song and dance and learning how to march and everything else, you graduate. And that's when I got my orders to flight school. Now, at that time, and this is, like I said, the Vietnam War era, there must have been 10 places in the United States where you could go for training in the military, for Air Force training. There were like 5 in Texas, Del Rio, Laughlin. You had Greece, you had Randolph. Probably forgetting something there in Texas, but there was, I think, 5 in Texas. They had them in Columbus, Mississippi, Moody Air Force Base, Vance in Oklahoma, Shepherd over there in Wichita Falls, and Reese. Anyway, and one located in the Southwest called Williams Air Force Base, Willie. And that was they called it the Palace, because all the other places you could go to, it wasn't great, but Williams Air Force Base right across. Williams is in Phoenix, Arizona, in case you don't know. And so that's where Williams was, Phoenix, Arizona State, 8. Just so happens, when I graduated from officers training school, I got sent to Williams Air Force Base, which works out great because I used to live in Arizona. I spent a lot of time there. I knew Arizona, Phoenix, Tucson. And in my youth, I grew up at a ranch in my grandparents' place in southeastern Arizona. So, went to Williams Air Force Base. Now, here's the way it was back then. It's not this way today. Well, back then, you went to undergraduate pilot training. You started flying a T-41, which is a Cessna 172. See how it looks. It's just a plain everyday Cessna. But you went through a civilian airport. Matter of fact, this one was out in I think Marana or somewhere that far away from the Air Force Base and uncontrolled. They had civilian instructors who were there. They were the instructors to put you in the T-41, see if you could fly. Now, originally, my class had 91 students in it, and so we all went to this field, flew in the Cessna 172, and frankly, some of the guys didn't make it. They just simply weren't designed to fly. They didn't like flying. They'd throw up. Who knew? Whatever it was. But that was a weed out. That was a washout plane where people who weren't going to make it were going to fail. And some did. If you completed that, you moved on to the Williams Air Force Base. You started jet training in the T-37. The Tweet, it was called. Twin engine, side by side. And you flew that. So you spent, half the day you were in class. The other half the day you were on the ramp. And you were flying in the Cessna T-37. And that you learned basic maneuvers, basic stuff, spin, getting out of a spin, a lot of stuff like that. Pretty common basic stuff. And I remember I'd flown with my instructor. His name was Bill Savage, first lieutenant. I was his first student after he got out of the training and being an instructor. And I remember after about, 8, 9 rides, whatever it was, we pulled off the side of the runway near the RSO shack. There was one on the field right by the end of the runway. And he said, "Okay, I'm letting you loose." And I went, "What?" "Yeah, you're going to solo." I didn't know it was coming. He gets out of the plane and climbs up and heads over to the shed over there, the portable tower. I'm sitting there in the airplane going, he's going to let me go fly this jet solo? And he did. And I did. So that was how I did T-37 training. And then about a half a year in T-37s, then you switch over to the T-38s, which is the supersonic, white. It's a beautiful aircraft. Beautiful. A T-38A at the time. And you flew that for the rest of the time. There you learn about different flight training things, especially formation. And formation is a big thing there. I mean, flying in two-ship formation, and you got 4 aircraft, that's a big thing. So you kind of learn about what fighter stuff does, when you're flying in the Thunderbird kind of nonsense. And you learn about terrain, flying, and everything else. And at the end of 1 year, about 55 weeks, which is what always is, well, you graduate. And out of our 91 class that we started with, 42 graduated. 42 out of 91. And I was lucky I was one of those. Now, wasn't a big thing. At graduation, you're out there on the ramp, everybody's in the group together, and you're there, and the people are there. My parents were in Europe at the time, stationed over there, because like I said, I'm a brat. And so they weren't there, so I had no family there, so I didn't think much about graduation because I'd been told the day after I graduated, I'm going to survival school in Fairchild Air Force Base up in Washington. So I was not really thinking much about graduation. I'm thinking, I got survival school the day after I graduate. Well, at that graduation, the commander at that time, his name was Ralph Maglione, and he was the colonel. He was the commander of the base. He was a former commander of the Thunderbirds. What I didn't even think about, behind us, the aircraft behind us as we marched around and everything were the U.S. Air Force Thunderbirds. They'd come to Williams Air Force Base because Colonel Maglione was their former commander, whatever. We were marching in front of the Thunderbirds. I never thought about it. It never occurred to me. I don't have any pictures of it or anything. I just remember what happened. So yes, I was class 7205. So if you want to look it up, there's where we were. I was in Skidder and Scat Pack. Those are the 2 squadrons you were in, whether it's 37s or 38s. And yes, I graduated and then when I did that, I ended up taking and flying the aircraft that I had chosen, because back in those days, a group of planes would come down. It was called a block. And the block would come down in all these different airplanes, and the number 1 person scheduled the class with academics and flying grades, that number 1 person would pick the plane that he wanted from that block. Number 2 would pick whatever else was left. Number 3, number 4, number 5, whatever. I was high enough in my class where I was able to pick an aircraft that I wanted. And I will tell you this, the aircraft I chose was, it was in the Midwest, because my best friend, and still my best friend today from college days, his name's BK. BK was doing his master's work at a place called Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana. I don't know. So I looked and seen the slots that were there, and there was an aircraft available to fly, a place called Grissom Air Force Base in Kokomo, Indiana, which was about an hour and a half away from Muncie. And I selected that base because my best friend was doing his master's work there at Ball State. Yes, he and I got together, but eventually he left. But I stayed in Indiana. And I have been in Indiana since the early 1970s. And you know what? I feel today I'm a Hoosier because I love this state and I have no intention of going any other place. I love Indiana. Now you know my story and how I became an Air Force pilot.